I'm going to show you 4 different ways to make your animated shot a little bit more cinematic, to make it pop, to make it stand out, and just more visually interesting. None of this is going to affect your character animation if that's what you've been doing, but it's all stuff that's going to support the shot that you're creating and take it from something that looks maybe like a generic test in a piece of software and turn it into something that feels like it could be part of something larger. And each of these is only going to take about 15 minutes, depending on your workflow, unless you decide to get really carried away. They should all be helpful, whether you're making a new shot for your demo reel, you're just trying to upskill and become more versatile, add some new tricks to your toolkit, or participate in any art or animation challenge to help your entry stand out. And speaking of challenges, before we jump into our tips, this video is sponsored by Autodesk, and they're actually holding an animation and visual effects challenge right now. We'll talk details a little bit later on, but this is for all students, whether you're high school, college, trade school, vocational school, all students can participate. There's prizes to be won. I'm gonna be helping judge, and the whole thing is themed around flight. And all you need to do is make something involving flight, which is super cool, very open-ended, a lot of creativity for you to just kind of explore. And the only other requirement is just to kind of keep track of your progress along the way and make an instructable or almost like a little mini blog or guide, or I guess outline of how you got to the final piece. So your works in progress, the concept sketches, blocking, just any things along the way that you can save as sort of it looked like this, and eventually it got to the final piece. A super good excuse to make something creative and just have fun with it. And the challenge goes until the beginning of December, so you have quite a bit of time to work on this, and you don't have to spend that whole time. You could just do a month, 2 weeks, 1 week, just an excuse to make something. Anyways, I'll have a link to it down below, and we'll talk more about it at the end of the video, but for now, let's jump back to our tips. Now, the first tip is to add surface imperfections, or a little bit of grunge or texture to your objects. And you can just take any object and add a texture to it, slap it on and have it have those colors, but that's not really what I'm talking about. In 3D, everything's very smooth and even, and our goal is often just to make things a little bit less perfect and more relatable, to bring that life back to these objects. And if I use my standard surface material as my kind of main example here, but the thing we really care about is right here under specular roughness. If we turn this up, the roughness becomes what looks like a matte surface. And if we take this all the way down, it becomes more of a hard plastic, more of a reflective object. Now, reflection and specular roughness, these are two different things, but for now it's fine. It'll just make it really glossy. And if we crank up the metalness, this will get even more pronounced because we'll get kind of a metal that doesn't really reflect the indirect light around it versus a mirror ball or a chrome orb. The fun part is when we start to introduce a little bit of variation to this particular channel. And what we can do is literally just create a node, hit tab, type in noise for the texture, and you can pipe that in specifically from a singular channel. Since this is just a black and white map, this works fine. So you can generate something procedurally yourself, or if you Google, seamless texture, scratches or something, we can just pull some scratch texture thing and just pop it in. Same rules apply. We're gonna twirl down the color, grab any of the RGB in this case, because we're just looking for a black and white value. We're not looking for the color information. And we're just gonna take one of those channels and put it straight into the specular roughness, and you'll see immediately what this starts to do. It takes the black values and makes them glossy. It takes the white values and makes them more matte. And so if you need to flip this at any point, you can use a reverse node, hit tab, type reverse, and you might have to twirl these down as well, but you can push the color in and pull out one of those channels and push it right back in if you need to flip it. Just gonna add some dirt to our object, and you can do this with fingerprints, scratches, just a general kind of like puddle texture look, however you wanna do this. It can be dirt, it can be rust. You obviously could go and use something like Substance Painter to actually do all your texturing work, but for an animator who's just trying to make this a little bit more interesting to look at, this is a really quick and dirty way to do it. But what's gonna make this really pop is tip number 2, indirect lighting. Now you can go in and do a whole 3-point lighting scene. I've done an entire video on how to light our 3D scenes with specific looks for daytime, nighttime, sunsets, and so on. My whole process is in that video. I'd recommend checking it out. I'll have it linked as well. But for now, I just wanna focus on one particular tip for indirect lighting, and that is the skydome. When you add the skydome light to your scene, it's just a big sphere flipped inside out and used as a light. That's really all this is. And if you hit 7 on the keyboard, your entire scene will probably blow out, but it'll be just lit from all sides by a big white light. Very consistent, very even, not really what you want unless you're doing some kind of like a product shot or something, I guess, maybe. You can mess with the intensity, but what you want to do is you select it, you can hit Control A to toggle between the channel box and the attribute editor, and we're going to pick a file. And what we want is a 360 image, specifically an HDR image or an HDRI. I use a website called HDRI Haven. They've got a bunch of them for free, and you can browse a bunch of different options, inside, outside, different colors, things like that. So if you want sort of a fall look or a forest look or something inside of a professional studio, you can just grab one of these different resolutions. So we'll download that, we'll pop it into this, and immediately you get to see that background projected onto the sphere. It's like a normal object, you can rotate it around, spin it, and where the magic is when you hit 7 on the keyboard. When you hit 7, it turns on the lights, and it projects a light using these colors from this orb. A reminder that if you hit 5 and then 7, that's just shaded and then lighting, so it's just the lights on the shading of the objects in the mesh themselves. If you hit 6 then 7, it turns on the texture stuff that you might have going on and then activates the lights. So 2 different ways to look at it. Again, you can spin this around and get the look you want, but you can see that this is gonna make all of our grunge and surface imperfections really pop. And this might be all you need for lighting. It's gonna make your scene look a lot more interesting and realistic, and it can be stylized too, but it's just gonna feel more relatable. It's what I mean by realism here. Because it adds the feeling of bounce light, that indirect light that makes things feel a lot more realistic and a lot less just computer-generated CG-ish with the really dark shadows that would never really happen with all the ambient light existing in the world. And I'll tell you 2 really important things about using this. The first is that if you actually render this scene, if you're actually using Arnold Renderer, it will calculate the light direction. It'll find the bright spots of your image, and it'll actually cast a shadow from this orb. You don't actually have to add lights to do that. But most of us are just gonna stick with a playblast, and that's fine, so I'll leave it in playblast mode. But what you might care about is that you may not actually wanna have this big background as a part of your playblast or of your render. And so if you are actually rendering the image and you don't wanna have this background, if you select it over here in the channel box, once again, Control A to toggle between channel box and attribute editor. If you go to the attribute editor, you go under the visibility tab. If you turn the camera visibility to 0 for this skybox, it won't show up in the renders. That's gonna matter if you're actually rendering, but if you're just doing a playblast, you're just looking in the viewport and you don't wanna see this image, you can't just hide it and hit H, because it turns the light off and you lose the effect. So instead you come up to the show menu in whatever viewport you care about and you deselect lights. This will have it hide from the viewport while still using the light effects that it's doing. And now you can playblast without it having to be there physically in the scene. So now we've messed with some textures, we've done something with the background and the lighting. Let's now mess with the environment itself, the world that we're inhabiting. I always recommend to do a little bit of set dressing just to spice up the environment and to make it feel like it's more lived in, that there's more going on here. That could be as simple as adding some bookshelves with some books on them, but making sure they're not all so perfect. You know, a little bit of inconsistency in the way that the books are next to each other. Maybe some are stacked funny, maybe some have fallen or they're on their sides, things like that, just to make the scene feel a little bit more alive. And depending on what you animated, if you have something, for example, shaking with turbulence or, you know, bumping around, if you take some of that animation, you can manually do this, or you can just copy paste some of the larger animation that you have in your scene, and you can apply it to these other environmental objects and just put them at an offset and adjust kind of the ratio of how much they're moving around, so not everything's just shaking violently. It'll make your world feel a little bit more connected and make it seem like the scene is more real. Your character's moving around with the environment, they're all experiencing the same forces. Whether that's wind or turbulence or gravity or, I don't know, some kind of an impact if somebody gets hit really hard and things all kind of push off to the side, a little bit of Dragon Ball Z action. Whatever you want to have happen, adding both set dressing and some environmental animation can really make the scene feel more alive and cohesive. And the fourth tip is to add some effects to your scene, but the easy way, to actually use image sequences to bring in some visual elements to sort of flesh out your scene. I did this with a Zelda animation back a couple of years ago where I wanted Zelda to hold a torch, and so I 2D animated just by hand drawing in Photoshop some frames of fire.
Wake up, Link.
And I think I comped it in After Effects and added a glow and everything. But you can just take a looping set of animation and put it as an image sequence with transparency inside of your Maya viewport. You can do obviously a torch, you could create campfires, you could do candles. Fire is a really good example of this kind of stuff. Or you could probably even do debris if you have a character landing with an impact. And if you have a more realistic style of character, this is gonna work really well. But if you have really cartoony characters and you find stock footage that's more realistic, the thing that's gonna allow these to blend together is your surface imperfection and that realistic lighting. I hope this video was helpful. Please hit the like button if you found it useful, subscribe if you want more stuff like this, and remember to check out the challenge, the Make It Fly challenge from Autodesk. And I'm really excited to judge this one because I can't wait to see all the different creative ideas on this take of flight. And not just the final projects, but also the step-by-step instructables that'll kind of break down the creative process. I think that's gonna be even more exciting than the actual final thing, is showing what you did to get there and what ideas you had along the way. That's super cool. So be sure to check out the Make It Fly challenge down below. Huge thanks to Autodesk for sponsoring this video. Once again, I hope this video helps with whatever it is you're doing. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Sir Wade, and I'll see you in the next video.